remember the first time I performed in front of a black audience. It is inner city suburbs of Melbourne, and it was in this garage-like venue, and I'd just seen a Facebook event pop up on my news feed. I didn't know who was going to be there, but I happened to be in Melbourne on that date, and so I went and checked it out. I was really curious about the description that said Black Arts Collective. When I went to that space, I was really astounded by what I saw. I'm going to rewind for a moment. I came to Ghanaland, Adelaide, from Eritrea when I was 3 years old. So I went through kindergarten, primary school, high school, university, here in Adelaide. And throughout school, I really learned about myself as the other. Let me explain what I mean by that. It seemed that to everybody in my classroom, or in the school, or wherever I was the embodiment of every type of other that there was. It was a very white area, so there wasn't that much diversity, not many people of colour, and there was so little awareness and exposure that whenever the teachers would mention anything about Indigenous studies, everyone would look at me. And whenever the teacher mentioned India, everyone looked at me. Whenever the teacher mentioned Africa, everyone looked at me. And this continued with everything, whether it was Muslims or Arabs or anybody else that we mentioned that wasn't white. So, throughout school, this is a time when kids usually get an opportunity to explore themselves and really see different role models, whether they're people that come into the classroom or they're teachers that are already there, through their interactions with their friends. And they can really discover different things about who they can be in the future, who they can be now. I don't feel like I really got that experience, because anytime I was represented, whether it was in history or whatever else, the few times, it was as the other. So that's what I saw myself as. I really internalized that. So when I was about 14, my sister and my 2 cousins and I started going to the city on Fridays after school. And when we went, we met people from all different backgrounds. We were meeting Africans on a regular basis, we were meeting Muslims, we were meeting people from everywhere who all had different stories. And this became kind of addictive to me. And I didn't realize the significance of it until very recently, actually. But at that time, I didn't want to miss a Friday, because there was some comfort that I found in that space. When I first started performing poetry, I was 15. I remember coming to a venue, and I had 2 poems with me. One of them was about my experiences. Since going on Fridays and kind of meeting other people that had similar experiences to me, I was suddenly unlocking a different part of myself. I was learning a lot more, and so my writing was becoming very different. So I had a poem about that. And my second poem was about happiness, and it was just about how to be happy. I looked into the audience and saw that there was nobody who was really going to relate to my experiences, and again, I just felt like the other. So I did the second poem about happiness, and everybody could relate, and it got me very far. It was universal. And I continued to perform poetry like that was very much about, just positivity and really lovely things. But it was never really being honest with myself, because I wasn't saying the things that I wanted or needed to say. This kind of thing translated into my activism and the work that I did later on in life. I noticed that every time I spoke, it was about reaching out to the wider audience and almost just trying to humanize myself, trying to change their minds and their perspectives. And this was a very exhausting thing for me, because constantly trying to remind somebody that you're a person means that you're not really allowing yourself to grow and see what there is of humanity, what kind of a person you can be. You're still stuck at that point of just, I'm a person. And I felt like in doing this, I was neglecting myself. Fast forward to a few years later, in this garage area, garage venue in Melbourne. When I stepped in there, I saw so many people of African descent from different countries who looked different, who were of different religions, who had different interests. I was in that space and I saw people who were writers, people who were musicians. I saw an exhibition in one corner, a clothes swap in the other, and all these things that I'd never really seen other Africans doing because it felt like we were constantly confined to the imaginations of other people. But in this space, we were able to thrive. We were able to learn from each other. We were able to see different versions of ourselves and see what was possible. And that's what I really felt. There were two things in particular about this space that were empowering for me. One of them was this representation. It changed what that word meant to me, and it became one of my favorite words. Because representation can determine who we decide we want to be, because we are influenced by everything that we see and everybody that we interact with. The second thing that was so empowering for me was that this space was run by Black African people, young people. It was a group of people who had decided that they weren't the other. They owned their identity. They knew who they were in this space, and they were taking a claim of who they were in this society. And they were determining what they would do. This was very empowering for me because they weren't asking for permission. They weren't trying to change anybody's mind, they were just being. And what they've done, what they've created, I know has inspired many more than just me. This was a really pivotal moment in my growth, but it didn't mean that it was going to be any easier to kind of change and see how I needed to make change. But I was determined to bring something like this to Adelaide because there wasn't much there. There wasn't much here in Adelaide at that time. Now, I'm 22. And over the past 3 years, there's been a huge change in my perspective and how I do things. So, when I came back to Adelaide, I was still working in the same space, and it became more exhausting to constantly be trying to change the minds of other people and how they perceive me, because now I knew what it was like to be in a place where I could be focusing on myself. And I noticed that in doing what I was doing, which was work that was so necessary, definitely, but I was neglecting myself. And not only was I neglecting myself, but I was neglecting anybody else who identified with my stories, who just needed to be the focus of the attention for a change instead of always being left on the margins while we focus on the wider community. So I started thinking about what these changes that I needed to make were. And they were to continue to create spaces, or to begin to create spaces, I guess, in Adelaide, where young people, like everybody that I was meeting every Friday, who were third culture kids, who didn't necessarily fit into the box of immigrant or anything else, where they could really decide what they wanted to do and who they wanted to be. And to bring in support for that kind of thing has been difficult at times. Because there's this tendency for us to think that the only way that focusing on minority communities, the only way that can be helpful to the rest of the nation is by finding ways to, whether it's assimilate them or make them connect with the wider community. But sometimes it's really just about creating spaces to foster that growth. What I find that we need is that for those who consider themselves allies, to really think about how they're helping and kind of shift to a model of empowerment, because what we don't need is for people who are not African, for example, to be holding an African film festival when somebody who is African could be doing that, because that is empowering. For restaurants to be opened, parading African cultures or whatever else when they're not African, because this takes opportunities from people who really do want to do something and take ownership of their identity and move forward. And most importantly, we need to make sure that when we see people like a group of African boys who are hanging out on the streets together, or a group of sisters who stick together in the classroom, or in a neighbourhood, or in a workplace or wherever else, this is not a threat in any way. This is simply people cultivating a space where they feel, or cultivating a sense of safety. Because living as a minority in this country can often mean that you feel like you're in a violent environment on a regular basis. And for me personally, what this has meant is that I no longer feel guilty. If perhaps today I need to just be around my African sisters, or today I just need to be around Muslims because today I might not feel like justifying myself and negotiating who I am and explaining myself, and that's okay. Because sometimes it's only in these spaces that we can really feel free. And when I stepped onto that, when I was in that space when I was 19 in the garage, I stood out, not because of the clothes that I wore, but because I had some dope lyrics to share. I had some really good things to say, and I was not simply my exterior, and that was an empowering thing, and it's because of spaces like that that I'm able to be here and really share my truth, regardless of who's in the audience. And that's the kind of resilience that we need to be building. And these spaces can help us. Thank you very much.